Hello and welcome to our movie recap channel. Today I'm going to explain a sci-fi and thriller movie called Archive from 2020. Hope you enjoy the video, so let's start. The movie opens in a snowy Japanese forest, where we see a man running as an early morning exercise and returning to his lab. The isolated forest houses a lab facility where a robotics engineer called George Almore resides alone with two robots. The year is 2038, and robots play an integral role now. George works for a robotics company called ARM, and he has been assigned by the company to create an AI prototype, but secretly. That's why he has been sent to this facility to work in private. George had created two female AI robots called J1 and J2. J1 was George's first AI robot that had the intelligence of a 6-year-old, whereas J2 had more developed intelligence equivalent to that of a 16-year-old teenager, which meant both of them were not fully intelligent. George checks up on his robots and puts on cartoons for them. J2 informs George that she had another dream last night where she saw herself with George, driving in a car. George gets concerned but assures J2 that it was just a dream, so she should just forget about it. Afterward, George gets a video call from his wife on an archive. An archive is a commercially available machine that can store the consciousness of a recently deceased person with whom their loved ones can communicate. George's wife, Jules, had passed away in a car accident while she was pregnant with his baby. Jules tells George that she misses him. She starts getting emotional, but her call gets cut off due to bad signals. Later that day, George gets a call from his boss, Simone. Simone seems pretty frustrated with George because he has not come up with any good inventions, and she believes he is wasting their time and resources. George had ulterior motives, which is why he hadn't revealed J2 to Simone. Simone only knew about J1, who couldn't even talk, so she is disgusted by it. She notifies George that she will be sending a security review team to his facility soon, which worries George. After the call, we see George continuing his secret project. George is creating J3, a new humanistic robot to which he could transfer full human consciousness and intelligence. J1 couldn't contain human consciousness or memories, so George created J2, which could contain only a few memories of a human mind. George had stored few memories of his wife, Jules, in J2. That's why she would dream of seeing herself with George in a car accident where Jules died. George had kept J2 and J3 a secret from his boss because she would have taken them away from George in the name of research. George gets back to work on J3 and transfers some of Jules's memories into J3, while J2 spies on George from behind. George would give these robots his wife's memories to make the robots sound like actual human women. J2 would get jealous of J3 and worry that George would abandon her because J3 was better than her. She asks George if he'll replace her with J3 because she's superior, so George reminds her that they are like a family and she is just different than J3, so he will never abandon her. Later, George successfully transfers his wife's memories into J3's head, but it overloads J3's mind. J3 starts panicking and screaming due to the overload of Jules's memories. George quickly turns her off and puts her in a hibernation mode so she can calm down. The next day, George heads out for a run but finds a wolf standing inside the lab. Someone had left the main gate open, that's how the wolf got in. George scares off the wolf and asks J2 why she left the door open. J2 denies having any knowledge of leaving the door open, but George disagrees because, beside George, only J2 had access to the main door. George checks the door security system and finds it crushed. He asks J2 if she did it, but she denies it again. George now starts suspecting that J2 is being jealous, and that's why she's doing it. Sometime later, George gets a visit from two archive employees, Vincent and Melvin, who were here to check up on Jules since her call was malfunctioning in archive. George quickly hides J1 and J2 and allows Vincent and Melvin to enter his lab with two of their robot security guards. Melvin checks the archive's logs while George chats with Vincent on the balcony. Melvin informs Vincent of suspicious activities. Melvin tells that someone has physically opened and tempered the archive machine for their personal use, which is illegal. George gets aggravated and harshly tells Melvin that he didn't check properly. Vincent takes a look at the archive and assures George that Melvin made a mistake, so they will leave peacefully. After they leave, George gets back to work on J3. He wakes her up from hibernation and tells her to remain calm while he runs some tests on her. J3 now looked quite confused but doesn't panic now. She gets agitated because she's attached to a machine and doesn't even have legs yet. The next day, George runs more tests on J3, like making her taste flavors, checking her speech, and how her body feels since it's not organic. J3 checks out all the boxes and works as George's first fully functioning intelligent robot. The next morning, George hands J3 a walkie-talkie and heads out to check the power tower in the lab because it has been causing a bit of trouble lately. George climbs the tower and finds some power lines messed up. While he patches up his work, George notices a drone jet flying near his lab, trying to keep an eye on him. At night, Simone calls George again and notifies him that the company has dispatched a risk assessor for him and he has new security measures for George, so George needs to meet him. George meets the risk assessor at a bar. His name is Mr. Tag, and he hands George a picture of him from 2 days ago, sleeping in his lab facility. Mr. Tag hands George a briefcase for emergency use only and reveals that George is being watched by someone anonymous. George returns home and dreams of the day of the accident when his wife died. He dreams of telling her that he got the project of working in Japan for 3 years to work on a prototype alone without any interference from anyone since the lab will be isolated from the city and has a beautiful house with a beautiful view. Jules congratulates George, but he senses that Jules feels a little coy, so he tells her he can decline the offer, but a car crashes into them, and George wakes up. He wakes up to a security alert. Apparently someone has breached his lab. He looks around the facility and finds J1 and J2 in their places, but J3 is missing from the lab. He runs to his car and opens the emergency kit, given by Mr. Tag. The kit had a gun in it and a communication device connected to Mr. Tag. The company automatically starts closing the lab doors as a safety measure, but George tells Tag there is no emergency and they need to open the doors. Tag opens the doors and warns George to only open the briefcase when there's an actual emergency, or otherwise they will send a response team the next time. The doors unlock, and George immediately prepares the drones to search for J3. He heads out in the forest with the drones and starts searching for J3, but unfortunately, after all the efforts, he doesn't find any sign of J3. He returns home and searches for gadgets in the garage until something falls on George from the upper compartment, and it's none other than J3. J3 yells at George and tells him that she remembers that Jules didn't want to live in this lab or wanted her consciousness stored in the archive. George explains that he loved Jules because she was perfect for her, that's why he archived her when she died. George takes J3 back to the lab, and she explains that J2 took her to the archive, and that's how she found out. George confronts J2, but she says it was a mistake, but George now firmly believes that J2 is jealous of J3, so he shuts her down and takes her legs for J3's body. He reshapes and redesigns the legs and pairs them with J3. After that, he completely renews J3 and makes her a new synthetic body, which is almost human. He also makes new legs for J2 and wakes her up. J2 realizes that he gave her legs to J3, so she feels depressed and suicidal. J3 now goes to the lake and eats breakfast with George like humans. She operates completely like humans. Now she goes running with George and dances with him. Afterward, George finds out J2 has gone missing because she went into the ocean and committed suicide. George doesn't find her body, so he buries her remnants with J3 and J1. At night, George goes to sleep while J3 starts remembering how Jules would sleep with George in bed, so she sneakily enters his bedroom and lies in bed with him. She tries to make love to George, but George stops her and tells her to give him his privacy. J3 apologetically leaves the room. She fully remembers now that Jules was pregnant when the accident happened, and she died. The next morning, George gets a furious call from his boss Simone, who informs George that she knows about his secret projects because the archive company found his robot, J2, in the ocean, and they filed an infringement case against their company because George had copied the archive device design, and that's how he was able to make J2. J3 smashes the screen to end the call, so Simone sends drones to the lab to evict George and destroy his projects. George quickly destroys all the lab entry systems so no one can enter, while J3 discovers that George plans on planting his wife from the archive into her, which means it would end her. Armed drones approach the lab and start infiltrating it. J3 holds a gun at George and doesn't let him transfer Jules into her. George convinces her that they will destroy her, and if she shoots him, then she won't have any future. J3 realizes there is no other option, so she agrees. While the transference begins, the lab doors open, and George finds no one, not in the lab or any drones outside. The transference successfully goes through, and Jules wakes up instead of J3. She reunites with George and celebrates, but the archive phone rings. George wonders who's calling him if Jules is in J3 now. He picks up the call, and it's Jules, informing him that the archive company says it is their last call because George's system is going to expire. It is then revealed that Jules had survived the accident, and it was George who died. When he was alive, George had signed up to archive his consciousness. Jules cries, says goodbye to George for the last time, and hands the phone to their daughter, whom Jules raised alone in George's absence. His daughter bids him farewell, saying she loves him, and George's system expires. Jules picks up her daughter in the real world and leaves in grief, and the movie ends here. I hope you liked the story recap. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.